From the deep, isolated woods of LaPorte, Indiana, to a terrifyingly quiet neighborhood street in Westfield, New Jersey, from the frozen, desolate wasteland of the high Arctic to the eerie, abandoned silence of Anjikuni Lake in the remote Canadian wilderness. Tonight, we are embarking on a journey through some of the most chilling, unexplainable anomalies in human history. We will travel back in time to the cobblestone squares of Nuremberg, Germany, and navigate the fog-drenched mountains of Gévaudan, France. We will plunge directly into the dense green hell of Mato Grosso, Brazil, before uncovering a grim, gothic puzzle hidden beneath the crags of Edinburgh, Scotland. Finally, we will witness a world-shaking explosion over the wilderness of Siberia, Russia, and finish our journey trapped in the absolute dark, thousands of miles beneath the surface of the remote South Pacific. We have an incredible lineup of mysteries to tear through tonight, and if you would like, leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. Our first stop takes us to a quiet Midwestern homestead in the early 20th century, where a sudden, devastating fire was meant to permanently bury a legacy of unimaginable horror. But instead, it exposed a forensic puzzle that would completely baffle investigators for generations. The heavy, suffocating smell of wet ash, scorched timber, and burnt copper hung thick over a ruined farmstead in LaPorte, Indiana, in the early morning hours of April 28, 1908. A small crowd of local townspeople and volunteer workers stood in a semicircle, their boots sinking into the black mud as they silently watched excavation crews shovel through the smoldering, collapsed ruins of the Gunnis family home. The brick foundations were completely blackened, still radiating a faint, sickening heat. Suddenly, a worker's iron shovel struck something remarkably dense, buried beneath a layer of collapsed roof slate. The men clustered around, frantically clearing away the hot soot with their bare hands until they managed to pull a deeply charred human torso from the debris. But as the local medical officer stepped forward to brush away the remaining ash, a collective wave of horror rippled through the crowd. The body was completely missing its head. The clean, calculated nature of the separation made it instantly obvious that this was no accident caused by falling timber. And right next to this gruesome discovery lay the smaller, unmistakable remains of 3 young children. A local farmhand named Ray Lamphere stood just a few yards away, his wrists tightly bound in iron handcuffs, his face pale and streaked with sweat. As the crowd turned on him, his eyes widened in absolute terror, and he began screaming at the top of his lungs, trying to convince anyone who would listen that this was not a tragic house fire, but a brilliant, cold-blooded masterpiece of deception, and that the real monster of LaPorte was currently running through the dark, completely free. To truly understand the pure madness of what happened on that property, we have to step back a few decades and look at the woman who built it. Belle Gunnis was born in Norway under the name Brynhild Paulsdatter Storsett, before migrating to the United States in the late 19th century in search of absolute financial prosperity. Physically, Belle was an absolute titan of a woman. She stood nearly 183 centimeters tall and weighed well over 90 kilograms, possessing a towering muscular frame that allowed her to easily perform the heavy labor traditionally reserved for farmhands. But beneath her hard-working, stoic exterior lay a mind uniquely calibrated for predatory calculation. Shortly after settling in Chicago, tragedy began to follow Belle like a dark, persistent shadow. Her first husband passed away suddenly from what medical professionals initially diagnosed as acute intestinal inflammation, occurring right after he secured a highly lucrative double life insurance policy. Belle collected the payout without a shred of public grief. A few years later, her second husband met an equally bizarre and sudden end. According to Belle's own testimony to the authorities, a heavy iron sausage grinding machine had somehow slipped off a high shelf in the kitchen, striking him squarely in the skull and causing fatal blunt force trauma. Once again, Belle collected a massive financial windfall from the insurance companies. Now, a remarkably wealthy widow, she purchased an isolated, sprawling farm on the outskirts of LaPorte, Indiana. But the insurance money wasn't enough to satisfy her deep, systemic greed. She devised an incredibly brilliant and deeply sinister marketing scheme, placing beautifully composed, sentimental Lonely Hearts advertisements in prominent Scandinavian language newspapers across the American Midwest. The advertisements targeted lonely, hardworking, and single immigrant men who had amassed significant personal fortunes. Her letters promised a life of domestic bliss, romantic companionship, and shared ownership of her beautiful, valuable Indiana homestead, but there was always one strict, unyielding condition hidden within her sweet prose. Any suitor who wished to visit her farm had to sell all of their earthly assets, convert their entire life savings into cold, hard cash, and tell absolutely no one where they were going. One by one, these wealthy, single bachelors packed their heavy suitcases with stacks of $100 bills, boarded trains to LaPorte, and walked through the front gates of the Gunnis farm, dreaming of a quiet family life with a loving widow. And one by one, they completely vanished from the face of the earth. The local community never questioned the sudden disappearances because Belle was a master of managing appearances, casually telling the townspeople that her guests had simply decided to return to their home states or had moved further west to pursue new business ventures. But the systemic slaughter could only remain hidden for so long. By the spring of 1908, the family members of a wealthy suitor named Andrew Helgelien began writing frantic letters to Belle, demanding to know his exact whereabouts and threatening to bring the state police directly to her doorstep. Then came the fateful night of April 28th. The entire Gunnis farmhouse erupted into a massive, blinding wall of fire that illuminated the Indiana sky for miles. The local community watched in absolute helplessness as the wooden structure collapsed into a mountain of glowing embers. The initial discovery of the headless female body and the 3 children led the local sheriff to immediately focus all of his suspicion on Ray Lamphere. Lamphere was a disgruntled, deeply obsessed former farmhand whom Belle had recently fired, and she had even complained to the local authorities that he was threatening her life. It seemed like a classic, open and shut case of violent revenge. Lamphere was thrown into a cold cell, facing the gallows for arson and mass murder. But as he sat in that cell, he frantically whispered a story to his lawyers that sounded entirely like the delusional deflections of a guilty man. He claimed that Belle Gunnis had deliberately selected a completely different woman, brought her to the house under false pretenses, slaughtered her in cold blood, and decapitated her to prevent dental identification. He insisted that Belle had then poisoned her own children, set her own home ablaze to fake her death, and slipped out the back door under the cover of darkness, escaping into the night with a heavy trunk overflowing with stolen wealth. The investigation took a sharp, sickening turn when Andrew Helgelien's brother finally arrived at the ruined property, completely refusing to accept the official narrative. He demanded that the sheriff conduct a thorough search of the soft earth surrounding the hog pen. Shovels broke through the muddy topsoil, and within minutes, the workers realized they were digging into a sprawling, systematic network of shallow graves. Out of the dark muck, they unearthed heavy burlap sacks filled with a horrifying sight. They found pulverized skeletal structures, severed limbs, and the advanced stages of decomposing human remains belonging to dozens of missing wealthy single men. The pure scope of the slaughter completely shocked the American public. Belle Gunnis had turned her homestead into a literal human slaughterhouse, utilizing lethal doses of poison during elegant home-cooked dinners before using her immense physical strength to dismember her victims in the cellar and feed their trace remains to her hogs. But as the town struggled to process the sheer volume of death, the legal case against Ray Lamphere hit a massive, insurmountable deadlock during the formal post-mortem examination. The local medical examiner took meticulous measurements of the recovered headless female torso found in the ash. He compared the physical dimensions to the well-known, unforgettable presence of Belle Gunnis. Belle was an absolute titan of a woman, a giant towering over the local townspeople. But the charred, headless corpse recovered from the ruins measured a mere 160 centimeters and weighed no more than 65 kilograms. The initial hypothesis of the detectives completely collapsed. The headless body in the ash was structurally impossible to be Belle Gunnis. The terrifying reality of that final night began to snap into focus from a completely different angle. Belle Gunnis knew the authorities and the families of her victims were closing in on her. She didn't panic, she planned. She had deliberately hired a new housemaid of a significantly smaller, slighter build, a woman whose sudden disappearance from society would raise absolutely no immediate alarms. On the night of April 28th, Belle systematically administered a lethal dose of poison to her 3 sleeping children and the unsuspecting maid to ensure there would be 0 living witnesses to her escape. She then used her extensive forensic and butchery skills to cleanly sever the maid's head from her torso, fully understanding that early 20th century technology could never definitively identify a headless, deeply charred corpse without a skull or dental records. She placed the substitute body near the foundation, strategically lit the fuses to consume the home in a catastrophic inferno, walked out into the dark Indiana woods carrying a small fortune in stolen cash, and completely vanished into thin air. Ray Lamphere was ultimately acquitted of the murders, but convicted of arson, passing away in a prison cell a year later, but not before confirming the entire terrifying escape plot to his cellmate. For decades, the case remained a lingering, spectral ghost story in American history, with hundreds of unverified sightings of Belle Gunness appearing in towns across the United States. But the final, spine-chilling confirmation of her survival did not surface until the year 1931 in the state of California. An elderly, quiet woman named Esther Carlson was arrested by local authorities while awaiting trial for fatally poisoning an older man to secure his valuable estate. Before the judicial system could sentence her, Esther succumbed to a sudden illness inside her jail cell. When investigators unsealed her private storage trunk left behind in her home, they discovered it contained no ordinary family heirlooms. Deep inside the trunk lay a collection of photographs and specific private assets belonging directly to the missing suitors who had vanished on the LaPorte farm over 2 decades prior. Modern forensic analysis and print comparison noted an absolute, undeniable match. Belle Gunness had simply changed her name, moved west, and quietly continued her predatory trade in the shadows, proving that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who can completely reinvent themselves to escape the light. While the historical horrors of an old Indiana farmstead show us how easily the physical remnants of a crime can be concealed beneath the dirt, our next story proves that the pristine, manicured lawns of modern suburban America can mask a completely different and altogether more insidious type of malice. It is a malice that does not rely on sudden physical violence, but on absolute, unrelenting psychological warfare, completely twisting a family's ultimate dream of safety into an inescapable prison of permanent paranoia. In the early summer months of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus felt as though they had finally achieved the absolute pinnacle of the quintessential American dream. Derek had recently celebrated his 40th birthday and had earned a major, highly lucrative executive promotion at a prominent insurance firm based in Manhattan, which finally provided the couple with the financial capability to elevate their family's living situation. They were the exceptionally proud parents of 3 beautiful young children, ages 9, 6, and 4, and their entire life revolved around finding a safe, historic sanctuary where their family could plant deep, multi-generational roots. For months, they had toured dozens of properties across the state, searching for the perfect location before they finally discovered a stunning, shingle-style 6-bedroom colonial mansion located at 657 Boulevard in the affluent, exceptionally peaceful suburban town of Westfield, New Jersey. The home was originally constructed in 1905, featuring grand architectural lines, beautiful cedar siding, massive brick fireplaces, and a deep, wrapping front porch that looked out over an idyllic neighborhood known across the state for its exceptionally low crime rates, pristine public parks, and multi-million-dollar real estate values. To Derek and Maria, this house was not merely a grand structure of wood and mortar. It was a physical manifestation of their decades of hard work, long commutes, and personal financial sacrifice. They purchased the historic property for a staggering $1.3 million, finalizing the closing contracts with absolute excitement. Before moving their young children and all of their earthly possessions into the massive mansion, they decided to invest several thousand more dollars into a series of light interior renovations, hiring local construction contractors to update the old paint, sand down the original hardwood flooring, and completely modernize the master bathroom suites on the upper floors. It was a warm, exceptionally quiet evening in June of 2014 when Derek decided to drive over to the empty house after the contractors had packed up their tools and left for the day. The summer sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the manicured front lawns of the boulevard. Derek walked up the front steps, unlocked the heavy wooden front door, and spent a few minutes surveying the progress of the painting crews. On his way back out to his vehicle, he noticed that a small stack of mail had accumulated inside the brass slot next to the wrapping porch. He reached inside, pulling out a handful of standard utility bills and advertising circulars. But wrapped tightly in the center of the stack was a thick, heavy white envelope addressed in rough, highly irregular black block lettering. It was addressed simply to the new owner. Derek sliced the heavy paper open using his pocket knife, fully expecting a standard welcome note or an introductory newsletter from one of the local neighborhood associations. Instead, he pulled out a multi-page typed document that began with an entirely jarring, unsettling greeting. The anonymous author welcomed them to the neighborhood, but almost immediately, the tone of the prose shifted into something deeply malevolent. The writer claimed that 657 Boulevard had been the absolute singular focus of their family for decades. The author explicitly wrote that their grandfather had watched the home in the 1920s, their father had watched it in the 1960s, and now it was their turn to guard the property. The text described how the author watched the house day and night, waiting for its ultimate rebirth, but what caused a sudden, cold wave of absolute dread to pierce straight through Derek's chest was when the author shifted their attention directly onto his young family. The writer asked why they had purchased the home, noting with alarming anger that the contractors were systematically destroying its history through the modern renovations. Then came the line that changed everything. The author wrote, "Have they found what is inside the walls yet? In time they will." The letter finished with an incredibly malicious question, asking if the new owners were planning to fill the grand old structure with the young blood of their children, stating that once the author knew the children's names, they would call out to them and lure them into the dark corners of the mansion. The document was signed simply, "The Watcher." Derek stood completely frozen on the historic porch, the warm summer air suddenly feeling entirely freezing. He frantically ran through the empty house, locking every single window, checking the basement stairs, and scanning the dark perimeters of the property before sprinting to his car and driving straight to the Westfield Police Department. The local detectives initially assured Derek that the letter was likely a highly elaborate, entirely inappropriate prank designed to scare off wealthy newcomers, but they advised the family to keep the details completely confidential to prevent compromising their initial tracking efforts. But within a week, a second, even more terrifying letter arrived, completely demolishing the theory of a harmless prank. This time, the Watcher proved that their surveillance was occurring in real time, utilizing sophisticated observation positions surrounding the property. The author wrote that they were absolutely thrilled to learn that the family had brought 3 children to the property, explicitly naming the kids by their actual private nicknames and referencing their exact birth order. The writer taunted Derek and Maria, asking if the children were too terrified to sleep in the grand bedrooms on the 3rd floor, noting that the house was crying out for them. The maternal horror of realizing an unknown predator was using her children's private names inside her own home completely devastated Maria. The Westfield Police Department launched a comprehensive investigation, bringing in specialized profiling units to analyze the text. Red herrings began to manifest rapidly across the affluent neighborhood, transforming the peaceful street into a hotbed of deep, toxic suspicion. Investigators first focused heavily on the Langford family, who lived inside a house positioned directly next door to 657 Boulevard. The Langfords' home sat directly parallel, meaning their windows looked straight down into the Broaddus's backyard. The home was owned by an elderly, quiet matriarch who had lived there since the 1950s, but her adult son, Michael Langford, was known to the community as a highly eccentric, deeply isolated individual who spent hours walking around the perimeters of his property. Neighbors reported that Michael had a long history of odd behaviors, and detectives hypothesized that he might be using his direct line of sight to spy on the Broaddus family. Michael was brought in for intense questioning, but he completely denied any knowledge of the letters, and a thorough forensic sweep of his personal living space yielded absolutely 0 typewriter ribbons, matching stationery, or physical evidence connecting him to the threats. Detectives then shifted their focus to another resident on the block, a wealthy citizen who reportedly positioned his lawn chairs directly facing the Broaddus house, staring at the windows for hours at a time. Yet, when scrutinized by law enforcement, this lead also disintegrated into nothing more than harmless neighborhood eccentricity. They even interviewed the previous owners, the Woods family, who had lived in the mansion for 23 peaceful years. The Woodses claimed they had never experienced anything unusual until a few days before they moved out, when they received a single odd note from someone calling themselves the Watcher. They had dismissed it as junk mail and thrown it away without a second thought. As the weeks turned into months with 0 arrests, a toxic counter-theory began circulating through the local community. The local media forums became entirely toxic, with citizens posting anonymous comments claiming the Broaddus family was simply looking for a major Hollywood movie deal or trying to secure a massive insurance payout, completely reversing the roles of victim and predator. Skeptics claimed the family suffered from severe buyer's remorse after realizing the massive financial burden of the $1.3 million mortgage and the extensive renovation bills, and that they were staging a hoax to legally break their real estate contract and sue the previous owners. The psychological trauma of this public skepticism pushed Derek and Maria into absolute isolation, but the direction of the entire investigation completely changed when a third letter arrived, containing details so hyper-specific that the theory of an external hoax entirely collapsed. The Watcher wrote a detailed critique of the interior renovations, explicitly referencing the specific type of wood flooring the contractors were installing on the second floor, and noting the exact dates the painting crews were operating inside the house. This was a critical turning point for the case. This information could not be obtained from a neighbor sitting across the street with a telescope or high-powered optical equipment. The author was either hiding directly inside the physical architecture of the house, monitoring the construction crews from hidden spaces beneath the floorboards, or they were operating as part of the specialized labor forces hired by the family. Derek and Maria immediately brought in private security firms, installing a massive network of high-definition thermal cameras, movement sensors, and around-the-clock private guards to monitor the home. Derek began patrolling the empty corridors himself at night, clutching a flashlight and hiding behind the curtains to see if anyone walked past the property. They fired several contractors and demanded that every single individual with physical access to the property submit to background checks. Yet, despite these extreme measures, the letters continued to manifest with absolute precision, bypassing the external security networks completely. Desperate for absolute answers, the family bypassed the frustrated local authorities and hired a team of elite private investigators, including former federal profiling units and forensic linguists who had spent decades tracking high-profile domestic terrorists. The forensic linguists analyzed the unique typing cadence, punctuation structure, and old-fashioned phrasing utilized by the Watcher, noting specific details like double spacing after periods and ancient grammar rules. The forensic linguists noted that the letters consistently omitted standard contraction rules, using do not instead of don't, and utilizing spacing mechanics that perfectly mirrored typing patterns popular during the mid-20th century. They concluded that the author was likely an older individual steeped in 19th century literary habits, who possessed a deep generational obsession with the architectural history of Westfield. But the true, stunning twist emerged when the state forensic laboratories conducted an advanced trace sweep of the adhesive material sealed beneath the postage stamp of the recovered envelopes. Using highly sophisticated laboratory equipment, forensic scientists managed to isolate a viable, clear profile of human deoxyribonucleic acid. The detectives fully expected this genetic trace to map directly to one of the eccentric male neighbors on the block, fully solving the long suburban mystery. But when the lab results were printed out, the investigation was entirely upended. The biological trace profile belonged exclusively to a female. This completely eliminated Michael Langford and all the primary male suspects from the operational profile of the killer. The entire case had to be viewed from a completely different angle. The Watcher was either a highly calculated female operative hiding in plain sight within the neighborhood associations, or the letters were the product of a coordinated domestic group, a husband and wife dynamic, where the female executed the physical packaging and sealing of the psychological payloads, while the male conducted the field surveillance. Westfield police requested voluntary mouth swabs from dozens of women living within a 2-block radius of 657 Boulevard to map against the recovered genetic profile. While several neighbors complied to prove their innocence, the genetic tracking ultimately hit a massive, insurmountable brick wall. No match was ever discovered, leaving the biological ghost entirely anonymous. The absolute deadlock of the investigation left Derek and Maria Broaddus in a permanent state of psychological devastation. They completely refused to ever bring their 3 young children into the house, realizing that moving into 657 Boulevard meant entering a physical trap monitored by an invisible, highly calculated predator. They attempted to sell the beautiful colonial mansion, but as the terrifying details of the case leaked to the national media, the property became completely stigmatized, labeled by real estate markets across the country as the infamous Watcher House. Prospective buyers vanished entirely, and the home's value plummeted. Desperate to salvage their life savings, the family petitioned the local planning board to tear down the historic structure and divide the massive lot to construct 2 smaller homes, which would allow them to recoup their losses. However, the local community rallied against them, packed the town hall meetings, and aggressively denied the building permits. Neighbors shouted that a demolition would completely ruin the historic aesthetic of the street, forcing the family to maintain the structure against their will, and leaving Derek feeling utterly betrayed by the citizens he thought would want to protect his children. Eventually, Derek and Maria managed to rent the home out to a tenant who was willing to accept the security risks, using the small income to offset the massive mortgage payments. Years later, in 2019, they finally managed to sell the home to a new buyer for a shattering financial loss of over $400,000. To this day, the true identity of the individual who watched that historic house from the shadows remains completely unresolved, leaving 657 Boulevard as a chilling monument to the hidden malice that can lurk behind the most perfect facades of modern suburban society. While the invisible phantom of New Jersey completely shattered a family's peace without ever shedding a single drop of blood, our next story takes us to the most hostile environment on Earth, where a legendary team of historical explorers vanished into the absolute dark, leaving behind a frozen trail of madness and a terrifying secret hidden within their own bones. While the invisible phantom of New Jersey completely shattered a family's peace without ever shedding a single drop of blood, our next story takes us to the most hostile environment on Earth, where an elite team of historical explorers vanished into the absolute dark, leaving behind a frozen trail of madness and a terrifying secret hidden deep within their own bones. It is a narrative that forces us to look past the pristine myths of heroic exploration and confront a regressive, systematic nightmare that unfolded in a freeze-locked wilderness over a century ago. In the late spring of 1845, the British Empire was operating at the absolute pinnacle of its global maritime dominance. The Royal Navy was determined to resolve one of the greatest geographic mysteries of the age, charting the final unmapped segments of the Northwest Passage, a hypothetical sea route through the icy Arctic channels that would completely revolutionize global trade. To execute this monumental task, the Admiralty selected Sir John Franklin, a heavily decorated, exceptionally seasoned 69-year-old officer who possessed decades of polar experience. No expense was spared in equipping the expedition. 2 massive, state-of-the-art warships, Her Majesty's ship Erebus and Her Majesty's ship Terror, were entirely retrofitted with the most advanced technology of the industrial era. Their wooden hulls were reinforced with massive internal iron plating to withstand the crushing force of polar ice sheets, and they were outfitted with locomotive steam engines that allowed them to navigate through freezing waters without relying solely on the wind. Most impressively, the vessels featured a revolutionary internal hot water heating network designed to keep the living quarters warm during the brutal polar winters. To sustain the crew during what was expected to be a multi-year voyage, the Admiralty packed the cargo holds with over 3 years' worth of state-of-the-art provisions, including thousands of meticulously sealed tins of preserved meats, vegetables, and soups. The crew consisted of 129 elite personnel, the absolute pride of the British Maritime Forces, chosen for their flawless discipline, physical endurance, and specialized technical skills. As the 2 majestic ships sailed out of the English docks, public confidence was entirely absolute. Naval historians openly declared that it was structurally impossible for an expedition so heavily fortified by modern science to fail. The ships sailed confidently across the Atlantic, making their final recorded stop off the coast of Greenland in July of 1845, where passing whaling vessels witnessed the crew in exceptionally high spirits, completely eager to plunge into the labyrinth of the Arctic. And then, the expedition dropped entirely off the grid. Months bled into years, and the initial wave of public excitement back in Great Britain slowly curdled into a massive nationwide anxiety. By 1848, when 3 years had passed without a single letter, sighting, or scrap of communication, the Admiralty realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's fiercely devoted wife, utilized her immense personal fortune to offer astronomical financial rewards, prompting the deployment of dozens of independent and official naval rescue expeditions. Over the next several decades, These rescue fleets systematically pushed into the freezing, windswept dark of the high Arctic, embarking on one of the largest and most frustrating search operations in human history. But what these rescue teams began to unearth along the desolate shorelines did not resemble a standard nautical tragedy. Instead, they discovered a trail of absolute, nonsensical psychological disintegration. Search parties navigating the barren wastes of King William Island discovered massive, 1,200-kilogram wooden lifeboats mounted onto heavy sledges, which the surviving crew members had attempted to drag for miles across the rugged, frozen terrain. But when investigators opened these lifeboats, expecting to find survival gear, weapons, and vital rations, they found the interiors packed with heavy, entirely useless Victorian luxury items. Dying, starving men had spent their final ounces of physical strength hauling heavy silver forks, ornate button polish, boxes of decorative books, scented soaps, and silk handkerchiefs across the ice. Scattered along the beaches were small, meticulously stacked stone cairns containing frantic, deteriorating handwritten logs that mapped a timeline of absolute disaster. The notes revealed that both ships had become completely, permanently locked inside massive, immovable polar ice sheets in September of 1846. Sir John Franklin had passed away inside his cabin a year later, and by 1848, with 24 officers dead and the ship structurally compromised by the shifting ice, the remaining survivors had abandoned the vessels, attempting to walk south toward a remote trading outpost hundreds of miles away. The initial investigation into the catastrophe left naval doctors and historians completely deadlocked. Early rescue teams hypothesized that the crew had simply succumbed to acute hypothermia, starvation, or a massive systemic outbreak of scurvy, a common maritime disease caused by absolute vitamin deficiency. This seemed like the most rational, comfortable explanation for the public. But as search parties began interviewing the indigenous Inuit populations living near King William Island, a much more unsettling narrative began to manifest. The Inuit recounted seeing a band of roughly 40 white men walking through the snow, describing them as dragging a large boat, looking entirely gaunt, pale, and walking in a state of absolute, disconnected confusion. The witnesses noted that these men could barely communicate, frequently stumbling and dropping dead directly into the snow where they stood, showing an absolute loss of basic survival instincts. The turning point for the historical mystery did not surface until the late 20th century, when a team of advanced anthropologists and forensic scientists decided to execute a systematic exhumation of 3 shallow graves discovered on the desolate shores of Beechey Island. Buried deep within the permafrost were the perfectly preserved, deep-frozen mummies of 3 young crew members, including a 21-year-old stoker named John Torrington, who had passed away during the expedition's first winter. Because the polar environment had completely halted the natural processes of decomposition, the men looked as though they had fallen asleep only hours prior, their hair, skin, and internal organs remaining entirely intact. When the medical teams performed a series of highly sophisticated chemical analyses on the recovered soft tissues and bone matrices, the autopsy results yielded a piece of critical evidence that completely upended the traditional history of the expedition. The lead concentrations inside the crew members' bodies were astronomically high, reaching levels that would cause catastrophic, acute heavy metal toxicity in a modern human. The source of the poison was not an environmental anomaly, but a structural defect hidden directly inside their state-of-the-art provisions. The commercial manufacturing firm hired by the Admiralty to supply the canned food had rushed the canning process to meet the rigid naval deadlines, utilizing a crude, high-velocity soldering technique that left massive globs of lead solder exposed on the interior seams of the tins. For months, the lead had systematically leached directly into the meats and soups the crew consumed every single day. Long before the men ever faced absolute starvation or extreme drops in temperature, their brains were being systematically destroyed from the inside out. The heavy metal toxicity caused profound neurological failure, triggering violent hallucinations, severe abdominal pain, explosive rage, and complete cognitive collapse. The nonsensical decisions, like hauling hundreds of kilograms of silver spoons and button polish across the frozen wilderness while abandoning vital ammunition, finally snapped into focus. The elite pride of the Royal Navy had been transformed into a wandering band of clinically insane individuals, completely stripped of their capacity for rational thought. But the final, truly terrifying twist of the Franklin expedition emerged when anthropologists turned their attention to the skeletal remains of the final survivors recovered from the southern beaches of King William Island. Under the intense magnification of laboratory equipment, forensic scientists noted that the human bones were scored by fine, linear, exceptionally sharp incision marks. Early historians had desperately tried to attribute these marks to predatory animal activity or violent altercations with hostile forces. But a closer analysis of the bone spatter and trauma patterns revealed that the incisions were perfectly straight, regular, and executed with extreme surgical precision along specific anatomical joints. These cut marks were not the product of a chaotic, drug-fueled frenzy or individual acts of desperate madness. Instead, the forensic data exposed an absolute regression of human civilization as the lead-induced psychosis completely dissolved their moral boundaries and the winter darkness closed in. The remaining personnel established a rigid, chillingly cold survival protocol. Even as their bodies failed and their minds rotted, the surviving officers maintained the strict, unyielding military hierarchy of the Royal Navy. They systematically executed their lower-ranking subordinates, utilizing their professional naval butchery tools to carefully process the bodies of their fellow crew members into systematic, measured food portions to prolong their own survival in the absolute dark. The lower-ranking seamen were transformed into literal fuel for the officers, proving that under the weight of an invisible, systemic poison, the most disciplined military structure on Earth could regress into an automated engine of calculated cannibalism. The tragic saga of the Franklin expedition remains one of the most chilling landmarks in the history of global exploration. In the 21st century, advanced underwater search arrays finally located the pristine, near-perfectly preserved wrecks of Her Majesty's ship Erebus and Her Majesty's ship Terror sitting undisturbed at the bottom of the icy Arctic bays, serving as silent wooden tombs for a legacy of absolute madness. But while the crew of the Franklin expedition met their horrific end due to a physical poison hidden within their own technology, our next story takes us to a remote lakeside settlement where an entire community completely vanished into thin air in a single fraction of a second, leaving behind an empty landscape that defies all laws of physical reality. The tragic saga of the Franklin expedition reminds us of how easily human civilization can crumble when isolated in the freezing dark, transforming an elite military unit into an engine of calculated survival horror. But as we move slightly south into the desolate, wind-scoured barrens of Nunavut, Canada, we encounter an entirely different type of polar anomaly. A case where an entire highly resilient community did not slowly succumb to illness, lead poisoning, or starvation, but simply ceased to exist in a single fraction of a second, leaving behind an empty architectural shell that completely shatters our understanding of physical reality. The year was 1930. Deep within the Kivalliq region of what is now Nunavut, Canada, sat a small, isolated Inuit settlement nestled along the rocky, wind-blasted shoreline of Anjakuni Lake. This was a place completely cut off from the modern world, accessible only by arduous journeys via dog sled or canoe through hundreds of miles of pristine, unmapped wilderness. The community was composed of roughly 30 to 40 permanent residents who had established a highly functional, deeply resilient way of life. These individuals were not fragile newcomers. They were generational experts in polar survival, completely synchronized with the harsh rhythms of the Canadian Barrens. They knew exactly how to track caribou through blinding blizzards, construct highly secure shelters against sub-zero winds, and navigate the treacherous ice fields of the deep north. The village itself was a vital oasis for the few weary fur trappers and traders who braved the extreme northern wilderness. The residents were known across the territory for their profound hospitality, always willing to share their precious hearth fires and warm food with cold travelers. Among those frequent visitors was a highly experienced, exceptionally rugged fur trapper named Joe LaBelle. LaBelle had spent decades traversing the northern wastes, completely accustomed to the isolation and unpredictable dangers of the wilderness. He had developed a close, respectful relationship with the families at Anjakuni Lake, often exchanging furs for essential supplies and counting the village elders as trusted companions. To Joe, this lakeside settlement was a reliable baseline of human warmth in a landscape that was otherwise entirely indifferent to human life. In November of 1930, a brutal, high-velocity Arctic storm swept across the territory, dropping temperatures to fatal lows and blinding the landscape with thick sheets of driven snow. Joe LaBelle found himself caught directly in the teeth of this blizzard, fighting his way through the whiteout for hours, his physical strength rapidly deteriorating. He knew his absolute singular chance of survival depended entirely on reaching the warm tents of the Anjikuni settlement. When the dark, wind-scoured shoreline of the lake finally materialized through the swirling snow, Joe felt a wave of profound relief. He expected to hear the familiar, chaotic howling of the village's massive pack of sled dogs echoing through the storm, and to see the bright, welcoming glow of whale oil lamps illuminating the thick canvas of the tents. But as he crossed the village perimeter, he was met by an absolute, suffocating silence. There were no voices, no moving silhouettes, and no smoke rising from the central hearths. Joe walked toward the first cluster of shelters, assuming the residents had simply sealed themselves inside to wait out the catastrophic storm. He poured his remaining strength into navigating the drifts, reaching out to pull back the heavy fur flap of a prominent tent, calling out a friendly greeting to the family inside. But his voice simply echoed hollowly against the canvas. The interior was completely empty. Joe hurried from tent to tent, his confusion rapidly mutating into absolute primal dread. The entire village was a ghost town, yet life appeared to have been frozen mid-breath. Inside one shelter, a heavy soapstone pot filled with caribou stew was hanging directly over a fire pit. The embers had long since burned down to cold ash, and the food had frozen into a solid, pristine block of ice. In another tent, a half-mended caribou skin parka lay on a wooden bench. A bone needle still pierced through the thick hide, exactly where a pair of human hands had left it. Most terrifyingly, the residents' vital hunting rifles, highly prized, modern firearms that represented their absolute singular means of securing food and defending against apex predators, were resting undisturbed against the tent poles. No Inuit would ever step out into the lethal Arctic wilderness without their rifle. Joe ran toward the edge of the camp, where the village's massive pack of sled dogs was kept. He found the animals still securely staked to their iron lines beneath thick layers of drifted snow. But when he brushed away the ice, his stomach completely turned. Every single dog was entirely dead, their physical structures stiffened by rigor mortis. A closer inspection revealed the devastating reality of systemic starvation. The animals had starved to death while chained in place, an absolute impossibility if their owners had been present to tend to them. Terrified by the absolute, unnatural stillness of the scene, Joe abandoned his heavy gear and ran for hours through the freezing dark until he reached a remote telegraph station miles away, frantically broadcasting a message to the authorities. Within days, a highly specialized unit of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the legendary Mounties, arrived at Anjikuni Lake to conduct a rigorous forensic sweep of the village. The detectives were uniquely trained in wilderness tracking and survival logic, fully expecting to discover a rational, physical explanation for the sudden disappearance of 40 people. The lead investigators first hypothesized that the community had suffered a sudden, mass evacuation triggered by a catastrophic panic, perhaps a sudden cracking of the lake ice or a perceived environmental threat. But as the Mounties combed the soft snow surrounding the tents, this initial hypothesis completely collapsed. There were absolutely no human footprints leading out of the village. If 40 men, women, and children had fled into the storm, the snow would have been deeply scarred by their heavy winter boots and sled tracks. Instead, the snow at the village perimeter remained completely pristine and undisturbed. Detectives then turned their attention to the dark possibility of a violent tribal raid or a coordinated attack by hostile forces. They looked for signs of a fierce struggle, looking for blood spatter on the snow, pulverized structures, or discarded weapons. But the interior of every single tent was in a state of perfect, immaculate order. There was absolutely no evidence of physical trauma or conflict. The Mounties then considered a third scenario. Perhaps a sudden, highly aggressive respiratory illness or foodborne pathogen had obliterated the population, and the survivors had buried the dead before migrating. But this theory also shattered against the complete absence of physical remains or tracking records. The case quickly descended into an absolute deadlock, completely defying the seasoned logic of the Canadian authorities. The investigation remained completely stalled for nearly a week, with the Mounties utterly unable to construct a single rational timeline. The breakthrough and the deepest horror of the entire investigation did not surface until a pair of tracking officers decided to expand their operational perimeter, walking to the edge of the rocky ridge that housed the village's sacred ancestral burial ground. This cemetery was a deeply revered, highly private site where the community had interred their deceased loved ones for generations, constructing heavy, elaborate tombs out of massive boulders to protect the bodies from scavenging animals. When the officers climbed the ridge, they expected to find the graves sealed beneath the heavy winter snow. Instead, they stopped in their tracks, completely paralyzed by what lay before them. Every single ancestral tomb had been completely, flawlessly excavated. The massive boulders had been rolled away and stacked in neat, precise columns on either side of the graves, a physical feat that would require the coordinated, prolonged strength of multiple individuals. But when the Mounties shined their flashlights down into the open pits, they found the earth entirely empty. The frozen human remains had been completely removed from their resting places. The discovery completely upended the investigators' understanding of the case. In the deep, unyielding tradition of Inuit culture, the desecration of an ancestral grave represents an absolute, supreme spiritual taboo, an act of ultimate malice that no living member of the tribe would ever commit under any circumstances, even when faced with absolute madness or starvation. The clean, geometric precision of the excavation completely eliminated the possibility of wild animals or primitive grave robbers. The bodies hadn't been dug up by beasts. They had been systematically harvested by an unknown, highly calculated force. Simultaneously, a critical piece of corroborating data surfaced from an independent patrol of Mounties operating several miles to the south on the exact night of the mass vanishing. The officers submitted an official report stating that they had witnessed a series of highly anomalous, structured, luminescent phenomena shifting across the northern skies directly over Anjikuni Lake. They described a massive, brilliant ball of light that constantly altered its geometric shape, pulsing with intense emerald and deep blue hues before accelerating vertically into the upper atmosphere at a velocity that completely defied conventional physics. The terrifying reality of the Anjikuni Lake vanishing remains one of the most profound, completely unresolved anomalies in the annals of modern wilderness exploration. Despite decades of subsequent searches, advanced aerial tracking, and deep historical reviews, not a single physical trace, bone fragment, or piece of clothing belonging to the 40 missing villagers was ever recovered. The settlement was completely abandoned by the territory, its empty tents slowly reclaimed by the shifting Arctic ice and the unyielding northern winds. The case represents a chilling deadlock where human logic entirely breaks down, leaving the empty shorelines of Anjikuni Lake as a silent monument to a force that can completely erase an entire community from the physical world in a single fraction of a second. While the vanishing at Anjikuni Lake left an entire village completely hollowed out by an unexplainable silent vacuum, our next story takes us back to the heart of 19th century Europe, where a single, mysterious child emerged from the darkness, possessing biological secrets that would ignite a deadly geopolitical war for the throne. While the unsettling emptiness of Anjikuni Lake left an entire community completely hollowed out by an unexplainable silent vacuum, our next story brings us back to the heart of 19th century Europe, where the sudden manifestation of a single, mysterious individual would expose biological secrets and ignite a deadly clandestine war for a royal throne. This is a narrative that forces us to look past the grand, romantic illusions of historical high society and confront a calculated, decades-long conspiracy designed to weaponize absolute sensory deprivation against an innocent child. The grand, unfolding mystery began on the exceptionally quiet, sunny afternoon of May 26, 1828, in the historic cobblestone streets of Nuremberg, Germany. A couple of local citizens were walking near the edge of the town square when they noticed a strange teenage boy fumbling his way through the shadows. The boy's physical movements were entirely jarring. He staggered forward with a clumsy, heavy-footed gait, his limbs twitching irregularly as if his brain was completely unaccustomed to navigating flat Earth. He held out a thick, sealed letter addressed directly to the captain of a prominent local cavalry regiment. When the citizens approached him, attempting to ask his name or locate his family, the boy simply stared back at them with wide, glassy, completely unfocused eyes. The only sounds exiting his mouth were a series of repetitive, meaningless grunts, and he occasionally whimpered a single, rehearsed phrase in a thick regional dialect, "I want to be a cavalry rider, just like my father was." Realizing the boy was in a state of severe physical exhaustion and profound cognitive deficit, The citizens guided him directly to the local police guardhouse. When the tracking officers stripped away his coarse, ill-fitting clothes, they noted that his skin was entirely pale, resembling a subterranean organism that had never experienced a single ray of direct sunlight. Most peculiarly, the soles of his feet were as soft and uncalloused as those of a newborn infant, yet they were covered in deep, bleeding blisters, proving that his current walk through the streets of Nuremberg represented the absolute first time his feet had ever impacted the hard ground. As the local authorities attempted to decipher his origin, they placed a quill and a sheet of paper in front of him, hoping he might draw a map or write the name of his home village. To their complete astonishment, the boy gripped the quill with primitive claw-like intensity and meticulously inked a single name across the parchment in clear, legible script: Caspar Hauser. Beyond that single written phrase, his vocabulary was entirely non-existent. Over the subsequent months, Caspar was placed under the specialized legal guardianship and care of prominent local educators, philosophers, and legal scientists, including the renowned jurist Anselm von Feuerbach. As his protectors patiently introduced him to language, teaching him basic nouns and verbs, the terrifying reality of his upbringing began to manifest through his initial testimonies. Caspar related a history that sounded completely impossible to the high society citizens of Nuremberg. He claimed that for as long as his conscious memory existed, he had been held captive inside a pitch-black subterranean cell that was no larger than a low wooden cage. The space was so mathematically confined that he could never stand upright or stretch his limbs, forcing him to spend 16 consecutive years seated on the cold stone floor in a permanent, hunched posture. He had never seen a single human face, experienced a change in seasons, or heard the sound of a human voice. Every single morning, while he slept a deep, unnatural sleep, a mysterious, faceless captor would slip into the dark cell, place a small loaf of coarse rye bread and a ceramic jug of fresh water next to his feet, and completely vanish. Caspar noted that the water frequently possessed a bitter, medicinal taste, indicating that his captor was systematically utilizing heavy sedative agents to control his sleep cycles and ensure he remained entirely compliant during his prolonged isolation. His absolute singular companions in the dark were two small, crudely carved wooden toy horses, which he played with in complete silence for over a decade. As the news of this bizarre feral child exploded across the European continent, the investigation rapidly became a massive battleground for competing social and legal theories. The initial reaction from local police forces and cynical journalists was one of absolute aggressive skepticism. A vocal faction of the community branded Caspar Hauser as a brilliant, highly calculated charlatan, a professional grifter who had spent his life operating inside a traveling circus or theater troupe, deliberately faking his cognitive deficits and physical limitations to secure public charity and the lucrative patronage of wealthy elite protectors. Red herrings flooded the guardhouse files. Detectives spent months tracking down missing runaway peasant boys across the vast agrarian regions of Bavaria, fully assuming Caspar was simply a lazy farmhand who had abandoned his agricultural duties and concocted an elaborate Gothic ghost story to escape legal punishment. They conducted exhaustive sweeps of local church records and asymmetric birth registries, looking for unreported adoptions or hidden households, but every single physical lead consistently disintegrated into nothing more than dead ends and empty neighborhood rumors. But the turning point that completely demolished the theory of an elaborate hoax did not come from matching paperwork, but from the rigorous, empirical reasoning of the prominent medical doctors and biologists assigned to study the boy. When these medical professionals subjected Caspar to a series of comprehensive physical and neurological examinations, they documented profound, unfakeable biological anomalies that completely defied conventional medical science. First, an analysis of his skeletal structure revealed severe, unique bone deformities in his lower legs and pelvic girdle. His knee joints were flattened in a configuration that could only be produced if his legs had been forced into a rigid, horizontal extension on a hard surface for his entire developmental childhood. Most shockingly, the doctors documented a hyperacute sensory apparatus that was entirely alien to a normal human being. Caspar's eyes possessed an extreme sensitivity to light. When he was first introduced to sudden sunlight, his pupils completely failed to constrict normally, causing intense physical pain. In total, unyielding darkness, however, his vision was near flawless. Doctors placed complex reading materials and intricate geometric shapes in front of him inside a pitch-black room, and Kaspar could trace the lines and identify the texts with absolute precision, displaying a cat-like night vision that was structurally impossible for a grifter to simulate. Furthermore, his olfactory processing was so hyper-acute that it caused severe physical shock to his nervous system. The scent of an open flower from several meters away would throw him into a state of sudden nausea, and a single drop of alcohol or tobacco smoke introduced to his environment would trigger violent, systemic muscle spasms and spikes in blood pressure. He could easily isolate and identify individual citizens walking through the crowded halls of his academy by matching their distinct sweat signatures from a distance of several yards. To the medical community, the forensic conclusion was absolute. Kaspar Hauser's body was a pristine, living canvas of absolute sensory deprivation. He had spent his developmental years in an environment devoid of sensory input, transforming his nervous system into a hyper-vulnerable, hypersensitive processing engine. The mystery shifted from a strange medical anomaly into a high-stakes criminal investigation in late 1833. Kaspar had spent 5 years adapting to modern society, showing a remarkable capacity for cognitive recovery, and preparing to publish a detailed personal diary that his guardian, Anselm von Feuerbach, believed would finally expose his captors. But the forces that had hidden him in the dark were watching his progress with absolute alarm. On a freezing afternoon in December of 1833, Kaspar was walking through the snow-covered paths of the Nuremberg court gardens when a mysterious, heavily cloaked stranger approached him under the pretense of handing him an archival document containing clues about his missing mother. As Kaspar reached out to accept the paperwork, the assailant drew a long, double-edged dagger and delivered a violent, deep thrust directly into the boy's chest. The weapon caused massive, catastrophic blunt force trauma and severe lacerations to his vital internal organs. Kaspar managed to stagger back to his guardian's home, gasping for breath as blood saturated his winter coat, before collapsing onto the floor and passing away 3 days later, leaving behind a historic city frozen in absolute shock. The investigation into his assassination yielded a critical piece of evidence that would completely unveil the actual terrifying truth behind his existence. At the exact site of the stabbing in the snow, police recovered a small purple silk purse. Tucked inside the purse was a single slip of paper containing a message drafted entirely in complex, mirror-reversed typography, a classical cryptographic method used by royal houses to secure highly confidential state secrets. When the investigators held the note up to a mirror, the text revealed a warning from the killer, stating that Kaspar's origin was a secret that would remain permanently buried beneath the earth. This cryptographic anomaly triggered a massive, deep geopolitical analysis by historical detectives. They bypassed the local peasant runaways and focused their attention directly on the Grand Ducal Palace of the House of Baden, reconstructing a timeline of cold-blooded dynastic manipulation that dated back to the year 1812. Reenact the cold, systematic palace conspiracy that transformed an innocent child into a biological phantom. In 1812, the Grand Duchy of Baden was experiencing a severe crisis of royal succession. The ruling Grand Duke, Karl, had married Stephanie de Beauharnais, the adopted daughter of Napoleon Bonaparte. The marriage produced a healthy, biological male infant who was the absolute, legitimate heir to the sovereign throne of the nation. However, the Grand Duke's stepmother, the ruthless Countess of Hochberg, was deeply consumed by a fanatical ambition to secure the sovereign throne for her own biological sons, who were legally excluded from the succession as long as the legitimate line existed. Reenact her cold calculation, she collaborated with a corrupt ring of palace physicians and high-ranking guards to execute a flawless, systematic switch. While the young mother, Stephanie, was recovering from a difficult labor in a separate wing of the palace, the conspirators smuggled a critically ill, dying peasant infant into the royal nursery, replacing the healthy prince. When the peasant baby succumbed to his illness hours later, the palace announced the tragic, sudden death of the royal heir, burying the substitute infant with full state honors. But the countess faced a severe dilemma. She could not bring herself to visually murder the true prince, fearing that a sudden assassination of a healthy child might leave behind detectable physical traces or trigger a massive investigation by Napoleon's federal agents. Instead, she demanded a punishment that was altogether more monstrous: The infant prince was completely stripped of his identity, placed inside a heavy wicker basket, and transported under the cover of night to a remote, fortified subterranean estate owned by one of her loyal noble co-conspirators. He was placed inside the low wooden cage, systematically fed sedatives in his water, and raised in absolute sensory vacuum for 16 consecutive years, ensuring his vocal apparatus, cognitive faculties, and physical structure would remain so severely stunted that even if he somehow escaped, he would be completely unable to articulate his royal lineage or claim his legitimate birthright. For 16 years, the conspiracy worked perfectly. The legitimate line faded, and the Countess's biological bloodline successfully secured the sovereign throne of Baden. But by 1828, the political landscape of Europe had completely shifted. The noble co-conspirator tracking the boy realized that maintaining a secret royal prisoner was becoming an absolute liability as modern forensic and tracking methods advanced. Completely unwilling to execute the boy themselves, they dumped him into the streets of Nuremberg with a fake letter, fully assuming the feral child would spend the rest of his short life locked inside a state asylum, completely forgotten by history. They never anticipated that the boy would possess a miraculous capacity for cognitive recovery, or that the medical community would unlock the forensic secrets of his upbringing. The moment Kaspar Hauser began writing his memoirs, threatening to expose the entire sovereign fraud to the international public, the cloaked executioner was dispatched to permanently silence the riddle of Europe. Kaspar Hauser was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery, his tombstone carrying an elegant, cold inscription in Latin that translates to, "Here lies Kaspar Hauser, a riddle of his time, his birth was unknown, his death a mystery." The Grand Duchy of Baden aggressively suppressed the official investigation, utilizing their immense political power to bury the forensic files and maintain the illusion of their legitimate succession until the dynasty eventually collapsed in the wake of the global conflicts of the 20th century. Kaspar's life remains a deeply unsettling landmark in the history of human malice, a chilling proof of the absolute terrifying lengths to which human power structures will go to maintain control over a sovereign line, leaving behind a cold transition into our next tale of a predatory creature that terrorized an entire nation. The high-altitude, fog-shrouded valleys of the Gévaudan region in southern France during the early months of 1764 were an incredibly harsh, deeply insular place to exist. The local population was composed almost entirely of deeply impoverished agrarian peasants, whose daily survival depended on herding small flocks of sheep and cattle across the vast rocky plateaus and through the dense, near impenetrable pine forests. These citizens lived in absolute, primitive isolation, completely disconnected from the grand architectural luxury of Paris and Versailles. Their lives were dictated entirely by the changing seasons and the constant, back-breaking labor required to keep their families fed. Because the mountainous terrain was highly rugged, young women and children were traditionally tasked with guiding the livestock into the remote pastures, spending long, solitary hours exposed to the elements, with nothing more than basic wooden staffs for protection. The regional wilderness had always been home to indigenous populations of gray wolves, but the local woodsmen were highly skilled trackers who completely understood how to manage the native predators. For generations, an unwritten baseline of survival had existed in the province. Wolves targeted the easy prey of the pastures, and the human population maintained the perimeters with traps and hunting rifles. It was a predictable, challenging existence, but the traditional logic of the valleys was about to be completely pulverized by a systemic wave of targeted malice. The structural peace of the region entirely collapsed during the warm summer of 1764. A young woman was herding cattle near the edge of a dense forest when a massive, dark silhouette materialized from the tree line, moving with a silent, terrifying velocity that completely defied normal animal mechanics. The predator bypassed the grazing livestock completely, focusing its absolute singular attention on the young woman. Fortunately, the heavy bulls within her herd instinctively charged the intruder, forcing the creature to retreat back into the shadows of the canopy. The terrified survivor ran back to her village, describing a predatory anomaly that was completely alien to the collective knowledge of the province. She insisted the creature was significantly larger than any timber wolf, possessing a massive chest, a long flexible spine, and a dark stripe running down its back. Weeks later, a 14-year-old girl named Jannie Boulet was not as fortunate. Her body was discovered lying in a remote meadow, surrounded by a heavy pattern of blood spatter that shocked the local recovery teams. When the regional medical officers performed an initial post-mortem examination of the scene, they noted a series of highly anomalous forensic details. The victim had not been consumed for sustenance in the manner of a starving wild predator. Instead, the entity had inflicted catastrophic blunt force trauma to the cervical spine, executing a swift surgical manipulation that resulted in targeted decapitation. Most peculiarly, the surrounding livestock remained entirely untouched and undisturbed. The first to notice this pattern realized that a normal wild predator acts out of basic caloric necessity, selecting the path of least resistance by attacking defenseless sheep or calves. But this entity was deliberately gnolo the entire livestock population, relentlessly tracking, isolating, and harvesting human targets with absolute precision. As the months bled into 1765, the body count across the province escalated with terrifying regularity, reaching over 100 separate documented cases. The sheer volume of human destruction completely paralyzed the regional economy, and the terrifying news eventually reached the royal court of King Louis XV in Paris. The monarch viewed the situation as an absolute international embarrassment, a public validation that his grand military forces could not even secure the internal borders of his own kingdom. Desperate to resolve the crisis, the king dispatched Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel and a highly trained regiment of Royal Dragoons to the mountains of Gévaudan. Duhamel launched a series of massive, high-velocity military sweeps, mobilizing thousands of local citizens to construct elaborate networks of blind traps, poison lines, and armed perimeters across the valleys. Red herrings flooded the captain's tracking files. Every few weeks, his dragoon units would successfully corner and slaughter a large gray wolf, presenting the bloody carcass to the terrified townspeople and confidently declaring that the historical nightmare was definitively resolved. The state-controlled newspapers would broadcast the victory across the nation, only for a new victim to be discovered 48 hours later in a completely separate valley, displaying the exact same pattern of targeted blunt force trauma to the throat and precise decapitation. Duhamel's initial military hypothesis that they were simply tracking a localized pack of native wolves suffering from an aggressive rabies mutation completely disintegrated against the absolute, calculated consistency of the attacks. The turning point for the historical investigation arrived when King Louis XV, thoroughly infuriated by Duhamel's absolute failure, stripped the captain of his command and replaced him with Francois Antoine, the king's own personal gun-bearer and the most elite marksman in the royal court. Antoine brought a systematic, highly analytical approach to the search, mapping the precise dates and geographic coordinates of every single predatory strike. In September of 1765, Antoine's tracking units successfully isolated a massive, unusually large canine near a remote abbey. Antoine fired a specialized, heavy-caliber projectile, neutralizing the beast. The creature was a biological titan, weighing over 60 kilograms and possessing a massive muscular frame. Antoine had the body meticulously preserved, stuffed, and transported directly to the royal palace of Versailles, where it was presented to the court as the official remains of the legendary Beast of Gévaudan. The public celebrated across France, and the military regiments were recalled to Paris. But the celebratory illusion shattered completely just a few weeks later. The silent, calculated slaughters resumed in the fog-drenched valleys of Gévaudan with absolute, renewed ferocity. The realization set in among the local trackers that standard military operations, massive grid searches, and heavy lead musket balls were entirely ineffective against this anomaly, plunging the entire case into an absolute judicial deadlock. The truth behind the terror did not begin to unravel until the summer of 1767, under the clinical, focused observation of a deeply insular local tracker and woodsman named Jean Chastel. Chastel had spent his entire life navigating the dense pine canopies of the region, completely refusing to accept the supernatural myths circulating through the panicked villages. On June 19, 1767, a prominent regional nobleman organized a final, localized community hunt to clear a dense section of the forest. Chastel stepped into the woods alone, completely bypassing the loud, chaotic military lines, and loaded his hunting rifle with a pair of custom-cast projectiles. As he sat quietly in a clearing, the massive ox-sized silhouette stepped out from the brush, locking its amber eyes directly onto the tracker. Chastel remained entirely calm, raised his rifle, and delivered a precise, high-velocity shot directly into the center of the creature's chest, neutralizing the anomaly permanently. But the true, spine-chilling twist of the entire historical mystery emerged when a group of regional surgeons and naturalists conducted an immediate, detailed forensic sweep and post-mortem autopsy on the creature's physical remains. When the medical blades sliced through the thick fur along the creature's flanks, they uncovered a piece of critical data that completely stripped away the illusion of a supernatural monster. The entity was not a standard indigenous predator, nor was it a mythical demon. The autopsy results confirmed that the beast was a highly engineered, deliberately crossbred hybrid, the product of an asymmetric pairing between a massive, aggressive imported domestic mastiff and a fierce timber wolf. But the detail that completely upended the investigation was the structural discovery of the creature's skin and coat. Stitching channels had been systematically embedded beneath the flesh of its back and sides. The beast had been meticulously outfitted with a custom-tailored suit of defensive body armor crafted from multiple dense layers of cured, dried boar hide. When the local peasants and royal dragoons had fired their standard, soft lead musket balls at the creature from close range, the projectiles had simply flattened against or ricocheted off the dense leather armor hidden beneath its long fur, leaving the animal completely unharmed and creating the terrifying illusion of an immortal, supernatural entity. The forensic reconstruction of the truth exposed a human conspiracy of absolute, unparalleled depravity. The hybrid beast had never been operating out of wild, predatory instinct. It was a highly trained biological weapon, deployed, guided, and maintained by a deeply corrupt, sadistic local aristocrat who operated from a secluded chateau deep within the mountains. The noble had utilized his extensive wealth and knowledge of military training tactics to raise the hybrid from birth, systematically conditioning it to hunt human beings while completely no-low grazing animals. He had utilized highly specific whistle frequencies and remote physical cues to guide the armored beast through the valleys, using the mass slaughter of his own peasant populations as a proxy engine for sadistic personal amusement and covert political leverage against the royal court in Paris. The creature's atypical predatory mechanics, the targeted manipulation of the throat, and the systematic decapitations were the direct result of deliberate human training, proving that the true monster of Gévaudan was not a beast at all, but a human mind operating in absolute darkness. With the neutralization of the armored hybrid, and the quiet, highly confidential elimination of the corrupt noble from regional society by local vigilantes, the terrifying reign of terror completely ceased across the valleys. The royal court of King Louis XV aggressively suppressed the official forensic reports and the details of the autopsy results, systematically destroying the tracking files to protect the reputation of the ruling aristocratic class and maintain the comfortable illusion of absolute state security. The tragic legacy of the province was quietly converted into a highly romanticized ghost story, a legendary fairy tale about a supernatural wolf, rather than a cold-blooded human conspiracy. But while the dark forests of 18th century France proved how easily human malice can engineer a physical nightmare to terrorize a nation, our next story takes us to the dawn of the 20th century, where a legendary British explorer would march his son directly into the dense, unmapped canopy of the South American jungle, seeking a myth of absolute gold, only to vanish into an absolute geometric vacuum that continues to baffle global history. While the fog-drenched valleys of 18th century France proved how easily human calculation can construct a physical nightmare to terrorize a nation, our next account moves across the Atlantic Ocean, deep into the suffocating, unmapped heat of the South American continent. It is a mystery where the primary adversary was not a physical beast or a hidden conspiracy of men, but the absolute, crushing vastness of the natural world, and how a lifetime of military trauma and esoteric obsession can transform a brilliant scientific mind into a permanent geographic trap. Over the decades, this specific territory would mutate into a literal black hole for human life, systematically consuming the skeletal matrices of over 100 rescue operatives and independent cartographers who walked into the green void, completely blind to the fact that they were tracking a man who never had any intention of being found. To understand the profound madness that structuralized this expedition, we have to travel back to the early months of 1925. the global press was utterly consumed by the figure of Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett. Physically, Fawcett was a near-mythical archetype of the classic British explorer. He was a highly decorated veteran artillery officer of the Royal Artillery who had survived some of the most catastrophic trench warfare on the Western Front during World War I. He possessed an almost supernatural immunity to tropical pathogens, a staggering physical endurance, and a cold, unyielding tracking intellect that had allowed him to map the treacherous, disputed borders of Bolivia and Brazil during his early career with the Royal Geographical Society. To the public, Fawcett was an absolute titan of cartography, a human machine who could carve his way through any jungle on Earth and return with precise mathematical data. But beneath his professional, stoic, naval, and military veneer lay a mind that had been completely fractured by the horrors of the mechanized war and deeply influenced by the booming occult movements of the early 20th century. Fawcett had become heavily entangled with the esoteric teachings of the Theosophical Society, transforming his baseline of scientific reasoning into a fanatical quest for spiritual absolution. While conducting archival research inside the grand libraries of Rio de Janeiro, Fawcett had unearthed a dusty, faded Portuguese document from the mid-18th century, known across the world as Manuscript 512. The text was compiled by a group of ancient treasure hunters who claimed to have discovered the ruins of a staggering, monumental stone city hidden deep within the unmapped Mato Grosso region of the Amazon basin. The manuscript described grand stone arches, complex hieroglyphic engravings, and massive temple complexes that completely contradicted the established historical baseline of the continent. Fawcett became entirely obsessed with this document, naming the hidden civilization the City of Z. In his private journals, his description of Z slowly morphed from a simple archaeological discovery into something altogether more cosmic. He began to believe that Z was the cradle of all human civilization, a utopian sanctuary built by an ancient race of white enlightened masters who possessed hidden spiritual technologies. For his final deployment, Fawcett completely refused to bring a large, heavily armed military escort, claiming that a massive footprint would provoke the isolated indigenous tribes. Instead, he selected a highly streamlined, deeply insular three-man team: himself, his eldest son, Jack Fawcett, a towering, exceptionally fit 22-year-old who shared his father's obsessive focus, and Jack's childhood companion, Raleigh Rimmel. In January of 1925, the small trio departed from the coastal docks, completely turning their backs on modern civilization and marching directly into the dense canopy of the Mato Grosso, a territory that regional woodsmen openly referred to as the Green Hell. The initial stages of their march were traced with absolute accuracy. Fawcett utilized local native guides and pack animals to transport their specialized navigation gear, high-end compasses, and light provisions through the outer perimeters of the wilderness. By late May of 1925, the expedition reached a desolate, sun-bleached clearing known as Dead Horse Camp, the exact geographic coordinate where Fawcett's horse had suffered a fatal injury during a previous mapping survey. This clearing represented the absolute, definitive boundary line of mapped reality. Beyond Dead Horse Camp lay a massive canvas of absolute geographic blankness, a dense vegetative grid where Western tracking systems completely ceased to exist. It was here that Fawcett paid his local native guides, instructing them to return to the outer settlements while he, Jack, and Raleigh hoisted their heavy canvas packs and prepared to cross the perimeter alone. Before the guides departed, Fawcett handed them a final historic letter addressed directly to his wife Nina back in England. The prose was remarkably confident, instructing her not to fear any structural failures or delays. He explicitly wrote that they were about to plunge into the unmapped zone where wireless signals could not penetrate, finishing the letter with an absolute directive. "You need have no fear of any failure." The three men walked into the shadow of the dense tree canopy, the heavy palm fronds closing behind them like a wooden vault. Then came the absolute, unyielding silence. Months bled into years, and the absolute confidence of the Royal Geographical Society slowly disintegrated into a massive, nationwide panic. By 1928, with over 3 years of complete silence, the international press declared the Fawcett expedition globally overdue. The absence of any physical fragments, clothing, or tracking data began to warp into a terrifying geographic riddle, prompting the deployment of a massive, uncoordinated wave of rescue operations. Over the subsequent decades, the Mato Grosso region mutated into a literal cemetery for human ambition. Dozens of wealthy, independent explorers, sensationalist journalists, and highly trained military tracking units plunged into the jungle to follow Fawcett's final path past Dead Horse Camp. But the environmental matrices of the Amazon quickly turned these rescue missions into absolute survival disasters. The search parties encountered a relentless onslaught of lethal tropical pathogens, starvation, and violent altercations with deeply protective, uncontacted indigenous populations. Over 100 rescue operatives were systematically destroyed by the jungle, their skeletal structures completely pulverized by the humid climate and reclaimed by the fast-moving thrum of the forest floor. The search for Fawcett had become significantly more dangerous than the original expedition, creating a multi-generational legacy of tragic failure. As the body count of the searchers continued to rise, a series of bizarre, highly compelling red herrings flooded the files of international intelligence agencies and geographical journals, leading researchers down a labyrinth of false trails. The first major red herring surfaced when a group of regional rubber tappers returned from the deep interior, claiming they had encountered an isolated tribal village run entirely by a white man. They insisted this individual was an elderly, heavily bearded white captive who was suffering from absolute profound amnesia, living as a worshipped puppet king within the tribe. The description perfectly matched Fawcett's physical profile, prompting multiple heavily armed expeditions to launch deep raids into the territory, only to find the villages entirely abandoned or populated by indigenous leaders who had absolutely no knowledge of any Western explorers. Then came a secondary, entirely jarring discovery in the 1930s. A local trader recovered a small, authentic brass signet ring from an indigenous village, featuring the distinct engraved family crest of Percy Fawcett. The artifact was presented to the public as absolute forensic proof that the team had been violently ambushed and slaughtered at that exact location. But a closer structural analysis of regional trade mechanics revealed that Fawcett had frequently used minor personal items and jewelry as currency to secure peaceful transit through tribal lands during his early career, rendering the ring completely useless as a chronological coordinate for his death. Other rumors claimed that the three men had deliberately chosen to shed their clothes, abandon their British citizenship, and integrate into a hidden, utopian spiritual commune to completely escape the psychological trauma of the European trenches. For nearly 80 years, investigators remained completely deadlocked, viewing every single clue through the traditional angle of a tragic wilderness survival failure. The absolute deadlock of the historical mystery did not begin to fracture until the turn of the 21st century, when a team of advanced researchers and biographical analysts decided to bypass the physical mud of the Mato Grosso completely, shifting their focus directly onto the private, unmapped family archives left behind in Great Britain. They subjected Fawcett's long-forgotten private correspondence, familial records, and pre-deployment journals to a rigorous forensic text mapping analysis. During this archival sweep, they uncovered a hidden, highly restrictive, absolute directive drafted by Fawcett himself, which had been completely omitted from the official documents provided to the Royal Geographical Society. In this private document, Fawcett explicitly ordered his family and the naval authorities that if his team failed to return by the winter of 1925, absolutely zero rescue operations must ever be organized. He wrote with alarming clarity that if they attempted to send search parties past Dead Horse Camp, a profound, ancient spiritual curse would systematically destroy any human who crossed the boundary line. This completely upended the operational profile of the case. The detectives realized they were tracking a man who had intentionally constructed a physical boundary line around his final coordinates, actively weaponizing his own disappearance to prevent human civilization from ever tracking his movements. The ultimate, spine-chilling twist of the entire case did not manifest until the year 2004 inside the clinical, silent vault of a highly secure private archive in London. Descendants of the Fawcett lineage finally agreed to unseal a heavily locked, long-forgotten personal storage trunk that had belonged directly to the colonel. Inside this trunk, researchers did not find standard survey maps, compasses, or geological data sheets. Instead, the container was packed with loose sheets of handwritten poetry, private diaries detailed with complex esoteric diagrams, and multiple complete typed theatrical plays authored entirely by Percy Fawcett in the weeks leading up to his deployment. As the literary and historical analysts processed the text of these plays, the true sequence of events was completely revealed, exposing a psychological reality that was altogether more profound and terrifying than a simple wilderness tragedy. Fawcett had never been hunting for a physical city of ancient stone and mortar to bring back to the British Empire. His deep psychological fracturing on the battlefields of France, combined with his fanatical devotion to esoteric occultism, had convinced him that the Mato Grosso region housed a non-physical, multidimensional gateway that led directly out of our physical world and down into a subterranean parallel reality. The theatrical plays he composed were a meticulous, step-by-step blueprint of his actual intentions. The protagonists in his plays explicitly detailed a highly calculated plot where an elite explorer deliberately orchestrates his own permanent disappearance within the jungle canopy, systematically shedding his Western identity, his physical clothing, and his physical form to permanently migrate his consciousness into a parallel dimension of absolute spiritual enlightenment. Fawcett viewed the Amazon not as a geographic territory to be mapped, but as an absolute existential exit velocity from a human civilization he believed was fundamentally doomed to self-destruction. On that fateful afternoon at Dead Horse Camp, the three men did not succumb to a sudden ambush or a tragic animal encounter. They had deliberately walked past the boundary line of reality, discarded their specialized navigation gear, and entered a state of permanent, planned isolation, completely choosing to allow the green abyss to consume their physical traces so they could finalize their transition into the dark. The expedition was never a failure of survival logic. It was a highly successful, irreversible psychological exit from the physical world. The true resting place of Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel remains an open-ended mathematical void in the heart of the South American continent, their physical remains completely dissolved beneath 80 years of dense, thrumming palm roots and toxic fungal matrices. The unmapped sectors of the Mato Grosso continue to stand as an absolute, green monument to the terrifying power of human obsession, where a mind can completely manufacture its own reality to escape the light. But while the legendary British explorer utilized the immense, silent canopy of the Amazon to completely erase his identity from human history, our next account takes us to a dark, Gothic cavern hidden beneath the steep crags of Scotland, where a group of young schoolboys would stumble onto a miniature cemetery that exposed the secret body count of the most notorious serial killers in European history. The old soot-stained skyline of Edinburgh, Scotland, has always been defined by a deep, atmospheric tension between the rational progress of science and the dark, lingering weight of Gothic folklore. In the early 19th century, the city was widely considered the absolute medical capital of the Western world, a bustling metropolis where brilliant doctors and anatomy professors pushed the boundaries of human knowledge inside grand stone lecture halls. But this rapid scientific expansion required a constant, frantic supply of biological subjects for anatomical dissection, creating a highly lucrative, deeply sinister underground economy. The steep, volcanic crags of Arthur's Seat towered directly over the city, a wild, windswept landscape of ancient stone and deep valleys that stood as a stark contrast to the cobblestone streets below. To the working-class citizens of Edinburgh, the mountain was a place of quiet escape, but it was also a canvas for deep superstition, a terrain where the boundary between the living world and the spiritual dark felt incredibly thin. It was a crisp, exceptionally clear afternoon in late June of 1836 when a small group of young schoolboys decided to trek up the steep, northeastern slopes of Arthur's Seat to spend the day tracking and trapping wild rabbits. The boys scrambled over the rugged ledges, their boots kicking up loose fragments of slate as they searched for hidden burrows along the face of the crags. While navigating a particularly isolated, near-inaccessible cliffside, one of the boys noticed a series of thin, flat slate slabs positioned against a natural fissure in the volcanic rock. The configuration looked entirely unnatural, as if human hands had systematically arranged the stones to camouflage the small opening. Consumed by absolute childhood curiosity, the boys huddled around the fissure, using their bare hands to pry away the heavy slate barriers. As the final slab pulled free, it exposed a small, low subterranean alcove carved directly into the heart of the mountain. The interior was perfectly insulated from the damp Scottish weather, completely dry and free of debris. But as the boys shined the dim sunlight into the recess, their playful excitement mutated into an absolute, breathless confusion. Arranged in perfect, immaculate order inside the miniature cave were 17 tiny wooden coffins. The boxes were meticulously constructed, measuring no more than 10 centimeters in length, stacked in 2 precise tiers, 1 row of 8 and a secondary row of 9. Each independent coffin featured a form-fitting lid carved from Scots pine, held tightly in place by tiny wooden dowels. The boys reached into the alcove, pulling the miniature containers out into the bright afternoon sun. With absolute trembling hands, they gently pried the lid off the first coffin, fully expecting to discover a collection of harmless children's toys or old historical trinkets. Instead, they found themselves staring down into a tiny, custom-carved wooden effigy. Inside the box lay a small wooden doll, its facial features hand-painted with stark, open black eyes and an expression of absolute, unnatural stillness. The doll was meticulously dressed from head to toe in custom, handcrafted white cotton burial shrouds designed to simulate a dead corpse resting inside a traditional structural vault. Every single one of the 17 coffins contained a matching, uniquely dressed figure. Terrified by the deeply eerie, ritualistic nature of their discovery, the boys gathered the miniature cemetery into their bags and ran down the mountain, completely unaware that they were holding a physical puzzle that would dead-end the legal and historical logic of the nation for generations. The bizarre artifacts quickly found their way into the hands of local antiquarians and journalists, prompting the prominent newspaper The Scotsman to publish a detailed public review of the miniature coffins. The mass media coverage instantly ignited a wave of absolute, widespread panic across the city. The early 19th century was a period deeply saturated with fear of the supernatural, and the local population immediately viewed the 17 tiny coffins through the terrifying angle of black magic, satanic hexes, and ancient witchcraft. Rumors flooded the regional police files that a clandestine coven of witches operating within the dark winds of the old town had engineered the effigies to execute an absolute, multi-targeted death spell against specific living citizens. Skeptics and logical thinkers attempted to counter this panic by proposing a series of highly plausible, alternative red herrings. Some maritime historians argued that the boxes were the product of a deeply insular tradition among superstitious sailors who constructed symbolic, proxy coffins for their comrades who had perished at sea during long voyages, burying them on land to grant them a spiritual anchor and prevent their souls from wandering the ocean abyss. Others claimed the entire discovery was nothing more than an elaborate, eccentric game devised by a deeply troubled child who spent hours mimicking the heavy funeral processions that frequently marched through the city gates. Detectives spent months tracking local woodcarvers, toy makers, and eccentric citizens, looking for matching tools or fragments of Scots pine, but every single physical lead consistently disintegrated into empty neighborhood gossip, leaving the entire case in an absolute judicial deadlock. The structural mystery remained completely frozen for decades, with early historians utterly unable to connect the 17 miniature coffins to any known historical coordinate or criminal event. The turning point did not surface until modern curators and advanced textile analysts at the National Museum of Scotland subjected the surviving artifacts to a rigorous, state-of-the-art forensic sweep. Using microscopic imaging and chemical analysis, the forensic scientists examined the physical composition of the metal rings embedded on the lids, the unique tool marks left behind by the original carving blades, and the exact weave of the fabrics wrapping the dolls. The data yielded a piece of critical evidence that completely demolished the early supernatural theories. The white cotton burial garments were held together by distinct, machine-made threads that were completely non-existent before the late 1820s. Furthermore, the specific style of the cotton weave and the painted black shoes on the effigies matched fashion profiles popular between 1828 and 1830. This narrow chronological window triggered a massive, deep historical correlation within the minds of the curators. The number 17 was not a random or aesthetic choice. It was a precise, terrifying mathematical match to the exact body count of Burke and Hare, Edinburgh's most notorious and cold-blooded serial killers. To truly understand the profound psychological devastation behind this correlation, we have to look directly at the absolute madness that gripped Edinburgh during the year 1828. William Burke and William Hare were two deeply impoverished Irish immigrants who operated a low-end lodging house in the Westport district of the city. They quickly realized that the prominent medical schools were willing to pay astronomical cash rewards for fresh subject matter for their dissection tables, completely nullo any tracking details regarding the origin of the remains. Burke and Hare did not engage in traditional grave robbing. They recognized that a freshly deceased body commanded a far greater financial premium from the anatomy professors, specifically the prominent lecturer Dr. Robert Knox. Over a period of 12 months, the pair systematically transformed their lodging house into a human slaughterhouse, utilizing a highly calculated, terrifying predatory mechanic that left absolutely zero external signs of violence on the bodies. They would lure vulnerable, single, or isolated citizens into their private quarters, intoxicate them with large volumes of whiskey, and then execute them using a specialized method of suffocation, one partner pinning the victim's limbs while the other compressed the nostrils and forced the jaw shut until the lungs completely failed. This process caused absolute blunt force trauma to the respiratory system without fracturing a single bone or leaving behind a traceable pool of blood spatter. They systematically pulverized the moral boundaries of society, harvesting 17 separate human targets, including a beautiful young woman named Mary Patterson and a deeply beloved local youth known as Daft Jamie, before their systematic engine of murder was finally exposed by a suspicious guest. William Burke was convicted and publicly executed in 1829, his own body systematically dissected by the medical school as an act of absolute legal justice, while Hare turned King's evidence and completely vanished into the shadows of the nation. But the forensic connection to the tiny coffins exposed a deep psychological trauma that lingered long after Burke was hanged. According to the rigid religious and cultural theology of early 19th century Scotland, the complete physical disassembly and fragmentation of a human body on an anatomical dissection table carried a terrifying spiritual consequence. It meant the soul was permanently mutilated, entirely unable to achieve physical resurrection on the Day of Judgment. The families and neighbors of the 17 victims were left in a state of absolute, agonizing despair, fully believing their loved ones had been denied eternal peace and were doomed to wander without a grave. Reenact the secret, frantic timeline of the individual who constructed the miniature cemetery on Arthur's Seat. He was not a witch, a sailor, or a playful child. The forensic tool marks on the pine wood indicate that the creator was a highly skilled local tradesman, likely a shoemaker or a leather worker, who possessed a deep, personal connection to the victims, or was consumed by a massive, systemic weight of survivor's guilt. Reenact his silent labor inside a dimly lit Edinburgh workshop during the dark winters following the executions. Overcome by a profound need for spiritual penance and proxy justice, he carefully saves small, discarded offcuts of Scots pine and fragments of cheap dressmaker's cotton. Using a sharp, professional leather knife, he meticulously carves 17 independent wooden boxes, shaping 17 tiny effigies to serve as symbolic vessels for the stolen souls. He dresses each doll in custom burial garments, mimicking the traditional funeral rituals the victims were so brutally denied. Under the cover of an absolute moonless night, the craftsman hoists the heavy bundle of coffins onto his back and silently climbs the steep, wind-blasted crags of Arthur's Seat, far above the smoke of the city that had pulverized his companions. He systematically carves out the low subterranean alcove, arranges the 17 tiny resting places in 2 immaculate tiers, seals the entrance with flat slate slabs to insulate them from the world, and walks away into the dark, completely choosing to leave his work as a silent act of spiritual restoration. The miniature coffins were never tools of malice. They were an engine of absolute, secret empathy designed to grant a final resting place to the unburied dead. The 17 miniature coffins of Arthur's Seat stand today as one of the most uniquely moving and chilling historical anomalies in European criminal history. While several of the original boxes were destroyed or lost by the schoolboys during their initial discovery, 8 of the pristine, form-fitting coffins remain beautifully preserved inside the permanent collection of the National Museum of Scotland, their painted black eyes still staring out at the modern public, serving as a silent, wooden monument to a multi-generational legacy of human remorse. But, while the dark crags of Edinburgh housed a miniature sanctuary designed to heal the spiritual scars of human murder, our next account moves across the globe to a massive, unmapped wilderness where a sudden, blinding aerial anomaly would unleash a thermal detonation so catastrophic it would instantly flatten an entire forest, leaving modern science completely deadlocked against a reality that defies the absolute laws of physics. While the volcanic crags of Edinburgh housed a quiet, miniature monument born from the deep scars of human remorse, our next account moves entirely away from human civilization, transporting us to a vast, frozen wilderness where an invisible cosmic force would execute a display of sheer destructive velocity that continues to keep modern physics in a state of absolute deadlock. It is a narrative that forces us to look past the comfortable boundaries of our atmosphere and confront a cataclysmic event that pulverized a massive geographic territory in a single fraction of a second, leaving behind a forensic puzzle that completely defies the established laws of terrestrial reality. The early 20th century inside the central region of Siberia, Russia, was a landscape defined by an absolute, unyielding isolation. The endless expanse of the boreal forest, known across the globe as the taiga, stretched for thousands of miles in every direction. A dense, near-impenetrable canopy of pine, larch, and birch trees, navigating a terrain of frozen swamps and rugged hills. This was an environment fundamentally hostile to permanent human settlement, completely cut off from the technological advancements of the industrial era. The absolute singular inhabitants of this remote basin were sparse communities of indigenous Evenki nomadic herders who moved their reindeer packs through the forest according to ancient seasonal rhythms, counting the wilderness as their private, silent domain. The core of this territory was mapped by the path of the Podkamennaya-Tunguska River, a fast-moving, isolated waterway that carved its way through the dense vegetation before emptying into the massive Siberian river networks to the scientific communities of St. Ten. Petersburg and Moscow, this region was a blank canvas on their geographic grids, a place so remote and logistically inaccessible that its baseline weather patterns, soil compositions, and geological realities remained entirely unmapped. It was a world operating in a state of primitive, undisturbed peace, completely blind to the fact that it was positioned directly within the crosshairs of a cosmic anomaly. The structural piece of the taiga entirely collapsed on the pristine, clear morning of June 30th, 1908. At approximately 7 o'clock, the sparse herders and isolated frontiersmen operating along the outer perimeters of the forest witnessed a sudden, cataclysmic visual distortion in the upper atmosphere. A massive, blinding blue trail of light, significantly brighter than the midday sun, tore through the morning sky, moving with a silent, terrifying velocity from the southeast to the northwest. The object cast deep, moving shadows across the landscape, radiating a wave of thermal energy so intense that witnesses positioned over 60 kilometers away felt their clothes burning against their skin. A fraction of a second later, an absolute, world-shaking explosion erupted over the forest canopy. The mechanical force of the blast generated an atmospheric shockwave so massive that it pulverized the atmospheric pressure grids, registering clearly on barometric tracking stations across Great Britain and Europe. The seismic shockwave slammed into the Earth, shaking the crust with an energy yield equivalent to a massive, high-velocity earthquake that instantly registered on seismographs located thousands of miles away in Germany and Washington. The acoustic detonation was so immensely loud that it was reported as a continuous roar of artillery fire by communities living hundreds of kilometers away from the epicenter. But because the region was completely isolated and Russia was rapidly descending into severe internal political conflicts, no official tracking teams or military units were dispatched to investigate the sudden devastation, leaving the smoldering ruins of the taiga completely sealed in a vacuum of silence for nearly 2 decades. The true scope of the disaster was not uncovered until 1927, when a highly analytical, exceptionally determined Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik managed to organize the absolute first scientific expedition into the deep Siberian interior. Kulik had spent years studying the global tracking data from 1908, fully convinced that a massive, ultra-dense iron-nickel meteorite had impacted the Earth crust, representing a monumental scientific and financial windfall for the Academy. Navigating the swampy, mosquito-infested terrain required months of arduous foot travel, with the research team relying on local Evenki guides to slice a path through the dense, overgrown taiga. But as the expedition finally crossed the threshold of the blast zone, Kulik's professional logic was completely pulverized by the landscape that materialized before his eyes. They had entered a zone of absolute geographic trauma. Flattened across an area spanning over 2,150 square kilometers were the fallen remnants of 80 million trees. The giant pines had been knocked down perfectly flat, lying in a massive radial pattern where their tips pointed away from a single centralized coordinate like the spokes of a giant mechanical wheel. The bark and branches had been entirely scorched away by a high-velocity thermal wave, leaving behind a sprawling gray graveyard of timber that stretched toward the horizon. But when Kulik and his team frantically pushed through the fallen debris to locate the massive, traditional impact crater they fully expected to find at the absolute center of the radial wheel, the investigation hit an unexplainable structural deadlock. At the exact mathematical epicenter of the super explosion, there was absolutely no crater. The Earth crust was completely intact, presenting no deep depression, no fractured bedrock, and no signs of a physical kinetic impact. Most peculiarly, standing directly at the center of the destruction was a dense grove of trees that remained perfectly upright. These vertical structures had been completely stripped of their bark and needles by the intense thermal pressure, standing like a collection of naked telephone poles in the middle of a flattened wasteland. Kulik was utterly baffled by this illogical contradiction. The mechanical force of the blast had clearly radiated outward from this exact location to level a forest the size of a major city, yet the fragile trees at the epicenter had bypassed the directional kinetic force entirely. Desperate for physical proof to support his meteorite hypothesis, Kulik spent months executing a systematic trace sweep of the territory. His excavation teams dug through the deep peat bogs, drained the regional swamps, and applied sophisticated magnetic detection grids across the soil layers, looking for a single iron fragment, a stone meteorite remnant, or a traceable concentration of extraterrestrial minerals. But the analysis of the soil consistently yielded absolutely zero meteoric material. The object had unleashed a wave of destruction 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Yet it had left behind completely no physical trace of its own material mass, throwing the early scientific community into a state of deep, toxic confusion. The investigation into the Tunguska event quickly became a breeding ground for competing, entirely radical scientific and fringe theories, as researchers struggled to resolve the complete absence of physical fragments. Early red herrings emerged rapidly across the academy. A prominent faction of regional geologists argued that the disaster was entirely terrestrial in origin, suggesting that a massive, spontaneous eruption of highly pressurized subterranean natural gas had leaked from deep volcanic vents beneath the Siberian crags, pooling in a dense cloud over the forest canopy before detonating in a massive fuel-air explosion. This seemed like a comfortable, rational explanation that safely bypassed the need for exotic cosmic phenomena. But when chemists analyzed the trace gas residues and mineral layers surrounding the standing trees at the epicenter, the hypothesis completely disintegrated. The soil lacked the specific sulfuric concentrations and chemical spatter patterns that an explosion of terrestrial volcanic gas would naturally deposit, leaving the theory completely unsupported by the empirical data. Other red herrings claimed the herders had simply witnessed a chaotic atmospheric weather anomaly, a massive ball of lightning that had mutated into a high-density plasma discharge before grounding out into the taiga. Yet, this theory also fractured against the sheer mechanical velocity required to flatten 80 million mature trees outward for tens of kilometers, a physical feat that required an energy output far beyond any known terrestrial weather system. The turning point that completely shifted the direction of the investigation did not come from the muddy soil of Siberia, but from the historic archival data preserved by astronomical observatories across the Northern Hemisphere. When international teams of researchers compiled the global meteorological logs from the late summer of 1908, they isolated an unprecedented atmospheric anomaly that broke the grid of traditional tracking logic. The true spine-chilling twist of the Tunguska event emerged when scientists mapped the behavioral sequence of the global atmosphere during the nights immediately following the super explosion. For 3 consecutive nights, starting on June 30th, 1908, the upper atmosphere across the entire European and Asian continents experienced a profound luminous distortion. The night skies glowed with an artificial, brilliant luminescence so intense that citizens in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg could comfortably step outside onto the streets at midnight and read the fine print of the daily newspaper without a single lamp or artificial light source. The air columns were saturated with a bright silvery green hue that completely eliminated the midnight dark, transforming the nocturnal cycle into a prolonged, surreal twilight. Advanced optical modeling and chemical sampling of the upper stratosphere eventually revealed that this global glow was produced by an astronomical concentration of ultrafine, microscopic dust particles suspended miles above the Earth crust, which were reflecting the sun's rays across the curve of the planet long after sunset. The advanced mathematical reconstruction of the truth completely unveiled the actual sequence of events, exposing a cosmic reality that was altogether more profound and terrifying than a traditional meteor strike. The object that invaded the Siberian atmosphere was not a solid, dense block of iron or stone. Instead, it was an exceptionally volatile, high-velocity cosmic entity, either a small, loose comet composed entirely of methane and frozen gases, or a highly compressed stony asteroid measuring roughly 60 meters across. Reenact the cataclysmic timeline of its entry into the taiga. As the object plunged into the atmosphere at a velocity exceeding 27 kilometers per second, the friction against the air columns generated a massive, escalating wall of thermal energy and immense mechanical resistance. Because the entity was moving too fast to compress the air out of its path, a colossal wedge of pressurized atmospheric gas built up directly in front of its trajectory. At an altitude of approximately 8 kilometers above the forest floor, the internal structural integrity of the object completely failed under the weight of this unyielding pressure wedge. The cosmic entity did not hit the ground. It experienced a sudden, cataclysmic high-altitude airburst, converting its entire kinetic mass into a single, blinding release of pure thermal and mechanical energy in a fraction of a second. This explains the absolute absence of an impact crater or trace metallic fragments. The explosion occurred high in the air, sending a downward cone of crushing air pressure straight into the taiga. When this downward blast wave slammed into the epicenter, it hit the trees from directly above, applying a purely vertical mechanical force that stripped away their branches but left the trunks standing perfectly upright like telephone poles. As the blast wave expanded outward from that central coordinate, the directional force shifted from vertical to horizontal, flattening 80 million trees like matchsticks in a perfect radial pattern across 2,000 square kilometers. The object itself was completely vaporized into an untraceable molecular dust cloud by the extreme heat, hoisted instantly into the upper stratosphere by the thermal plume, where it drifted across the globe to produce the historic glowing nights of Europe. The cataclysmic legacy of the Tunguska superexplosion remains an open-ended, deeply troubling landmark in the annals of modern theoretical physics. Because some trace elements of regional plant life at the epicenter subsequently exhibited strange growth mutations and anomalous tracking patterns, a faction of modern physicists continues to entertain exotic alternative models, suggesting everything from a tiny fragment of raw dark matter perforating the planet to a micro-black hole passing cleanly through the Earth crust, before exiting through the Atlantic Ocean. Today, the Tunguska site has been slowly reclaimed by the dense, thrumming growth of the new Siberian taiga, the gray skeletal trunks of 1908 buried beneath layers of moss and new pine needles. The case stands as an absolute warning of the silent, unpredictable forces that navigate our solar system, a chilling proof that our planet exists inside a cosmic shooting gallery where an invisible anomaly can erase a massive territory in a single breath, leaving behind only a standing, dead forest to witness the dark. While the sudden thermal devastation over the isolated forests of Siberia reminds us of how vulnerable our planet is to invisible cosmic forces navigating the upper atmosphere, our final account takes us in the completely opposite direction. We are plunging directly away from the light, down past the continental shelves, and into the absolute blackness of the deepest ocean trenches on Earth. It is a narrative that forces us to confront the fact that over 80% of our planet's oceans remain completely unmapped, entirely unobserved, and fundamentally alien to human science. In this vast high-pressure wilderness, an anomaly would manifest that completely pulverized the established limits of marine biology, leaving modern science in an absolute tactical deadlock against an acoustic reality that sounds like a living entity, but possesses a structural scale that defies all physical laws of nature. To truly understand the profound scale of this mystery, we have to step back into the dark decades of the Cold War and look at the secret technology the United States military established beneath the waves. Throughout the mid-20th century, the United States Navy understood that its absolute singular defense against a sudden catastrophic conflict depended entirely on its capability to track underwater movements. They constructed a massive, highly classified architectural network known as the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS. This network consisted of hundreds of hypersensitive underwater microphones, called hydrophones, which were systematically anchored directly to the ocean floor along the deep sound channel of the world's oceans. This specific thermal layer of the sea, known to oceanographers as the SOFAR channel, acts as a natural acoustic pipeline, focusing sound waves so perfectly that low-frequency noises can travel for thousands of miles through the water without losing their initial mechanical energy. For decades, the SOSUS network operated in absolute, total secrecy, its data streams monitored around the clock by highly disciplined naval intelligence technicians whose sole operational purpose was absolute tactical tracking, listening for the faint, distinct hum of Soviet nuclear submarine propellers cutting through the abyssal dark. The location of these arrays and the acoustic profiles they gathered were among the most heavily guarded military secrets of the 20th century. But by the late 20th century, specifically the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union completely altered the operational landscape. The United States military realized that maintaining the massive SOSUS network exclusively for anti-submarine warfare was no longer financially or strategically efficient. In an unprecedented move, the Navy decided to grant a select group of civilian scientists and researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration partial access to these highly secure acoustic data streams. For the first time in human history, oceanographers were given a direct, real-time audio feed into the unmapped depths of the planet's vast oceans. They fully expected to utilize this state-of-the-art military grid to track the seasonal migration patterns of massive blue whale families, record the tectonic groans of underwater volcanic eruptions, and map the internal shifts of deep maritime fault lines. It was a golden age of marine acoustics, a period where civilian science was confidently expanding its baseline of data. But the comfortable assumptions of the civilian research community were about to be completely shattered by a single terrifying spike on their digital recording monitors. It was the early spring of 1997 when a highly analytical, exceptionally meticulous civilian data engineer named Christopher Fox sat inside a silent monitoring facility reviewing the visual frequency readouts gathered by the South Pacific hydrophone arrays. The facility was quiet, with the automated systems processing thousands of hours of ambient deep-sea audio, which traditionally looked like a steady, continuous wave of low-level background thrumming. Suddenly, an unprecedented, colossal visual spike manifested directly across the monitoring grids, causing the digital tracking pens to deflect to their absolute maximum limits. A sound wave of unimaginable intensity had erupted from the absolute dark of the abyssal trenches. Fox immediately adjusted his specialized audio equipment, fully expecting the noise to be a standard system error or a sudden localized anomaly caused by a faulty underwater cable casing. But as he expanded the operational tracking data, the true scope of the phenomenon completely stunned him. The sound was not captured by a single isolated microphone. This massive, low-frequency wave was so immensely powerful that it had rippled cleanly across thousands of miles of deep ocean, triggering separate military hydrophone sensors positioned over 5,000 kilometers apart across the entire expanse of the South Pacific. The acoustic profile of the anomaly was entirely unique, lasting for precisely 1 minute. It began with an ultra-low frequency rumble that gradually escalated with a strange, high-velocity rhythmic variation, a distinct rising frequency that sounded remarkably like a massive biological entity letting loose a sudden vocal call. Oceanographers who had spent their entire lives cataloging the sounds of the deep sea had never encountered an acoustic payload of such absolute physical magnitude. The sheer intensity of the audio stream completely filled the sound spectrum, prompting the research team to designate the unexplainable deep-sea anomaly as the bloop. The publication of the acoustic data instantly ignited a massive wave of anxiety and profound curiosity across both the military and scientific communities, launching an immediate, systematic effort to identify the physical mechanism capable of generating a sound that could saturate an entire ocean basin. The investigators from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration immediately formulated a series of rational terrestrial hypotheses to explain the phenomenon, launching a comprehensive review of all maritime traffic, geological activity, and biological profiles within the South Pacific. The first major red herring emerged when a prominent faction of naval intelligence analysts argued that the sound was entirely man-made. They suggested that the anomaly was the product of a highly classified, deep-water military exercise involving a foreign superpower testing an experimental underwater weapon system, or the sudden, catastrophic structural collapse of an unmapped nuclear submarine hull that had crossed its maximum depth threshold and been instantly pulverized by the crushing pressure of a deep trench. This seemed like an exceptionally comfortable, logical explanation that safely protected the public from supernatural panic. But when acoustic engineers subjected the recording of the bloop to a rigorous digital comparison against the vast naval archives of maritime explosions, torpedo impacts, and submarine hull implosions, the hypothesis completely disintegrated. Human technology, when collapsing under pressure or detonating, produces a sharp, instantaneous acoustic fracture, a sudden cliff-like wave on the frequency graphs. The bloop, however, possessed a fluid, undulating frequency modulation that rose and fell with an organic cadence, a structural variation that was physically impossible for a metal structure or a standard explosive charge to simulate. Faced with the collapse of the military theory, the scientific community rapidly shifted its focus to a biological angle, leading researchers down a secondary, entirely jarring path of speculation. A vocal group of marine biologists argued that the sound must be organic in origin, suggesting that the hydrophones had simply captured the vocalizations of a massive, completely undocumented species of apex predator living in the unexplored depths of the ocean. They noted that the frequency curve of the sound perfectly mirrored the structural shape of a blue whale's call, which led them to hypothesize that a single, mutant blue whale of unprecedented physical size, or perhaps a completely new class of giant squid or abyssal leviathan, had broadcast a vocal signal through the SOFAR channel. But this biological explanation immediately fractured against basic mathematical and physical limits. The absolute volume of the bloop was so astronomically massive that it exceeded the maximum vocal capability of a blue whale, the largest known biological organism in the history of the Earth, by a factor of over 10. For an animal to possess a respiratory matrix, lung capacity, or vocal apparatus capable of displacing enough water to project a low-frequency sound wave over 5,000 kilometers, the creature would have to structurally measure hundreds of meters in length. It would have to be significantly larger than any dinosaur or whale that has ever existed, a biological titan larger than an entire modern naval aircraft carrier. The pure absurdity of an animal of that scale navigating through the ocean without ever being detected by surface sonar, commercial fishing fleets, or satellite tracking networks threw the scientific community into an absolute deadlock, leaving the investigation completely frozen for years. The absolute deadlock of the mystery did not begin to fracture until a specialized team of acoustic engineers and sound cartographers decided to bypass the biological debates completely, applying a rigorous system of mathematical acoustic triangulation to the original digital recordings. By calculating the precise microsecond differences in the arrival times of the sound wave as it struck the separate scattered hydrophone stations across the global SOSUS grid, they successfully isolated the exact geographic coordinates of the anomaly's origin point. The heart of the supersound was localized to a remarkably remote, completely desolate patch of the South Pacific Ocean, positioned several hundred miles off the icy, wind-blasted coast of southern Chile. This coordinate represented one of the most isolated maritime sectors on the entire planet, a vast, watery desert far removed from commercial shipping lanes, underwater volcanic structures, or traditional whale migration pathways. But the true, spine-chilling twist of the entire case did not emerge from a newly unsealed naval document or a deep-sea biological discovery. Instead, it manifested from an undeniable, terrifying mathematical correlation that upended the cognitive baseline of the researchers. When the sound cartographers plotted the exact geographic coordinates of the bloop's epicenter onto a global map, they realized it sat right next to a historic coordinate that was deeply embedded in the annals of American fiction. Precisely 70 years prior to the event, in 1926, a legendary horror author named Howard Phillips Lovecraft had composed his classic piece of cosmic fiction, detailing a terrifying mythology of ancient monsters sleeping beneath the waves. In his texts, Lovecraft had explicitly written the exact latitude and longitude for a legendary, sunken cyclopean stone city named R'lyeh. He prophesied that deep within this non-physical abyssal architecture, a massive tentacled apex entity lay sleeping in a state of permanent eternal paralysis, waiting for the stars to align so it could wake and release a world-shaking vocal roar from the dark. When modern oceanographers checked the mathematical alignment, they discovered that the actual, physical origin point of the largest underwater biological sound in human history missed Lovecraft's fictional coordinates for the monster's tomb by a mere handful of nautical miles. The fact that an author sitting in a quiet New England study in 1926 could accurately pinpoint the exact remote sector of the global ocean where a monstrous, unexplainable sound would manifest 7 decades later, long before the technology to monitor or navigate the deep trenches of the South Pacific even existed. It is a mathematical coincidence so profoundly eerie that it left the scientific community completely chilled. In the years following the public revelation of this correlation, official government agencies and the leadership of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration aggressively attempted to neutralize the public panic and steer the narrative back toward a traditional, comfortable geological explanation. They launched a series of dedicated tracking expeditions to the southern perimeters of the South Pacific, deploying specialized acoustic arrays near the massive ice shelves of Antarctica. By the early 2010s, the official consensus shifted to a theory that the anomaly was produced by a massive ice quake, the sudden, catastrophic structural fracturing of colossal ice sheets calving off the polar shelves and scraping along the ocean floor. To the general public, this represents the official, scientifically closed resolution to the mystery of the deep. They claim the ice quakes produce an organic-looking acoustic signature that matches the digital readouts of 1997 perfectly. Yet, to this day, a dedicated faction of acoustic engineers, independent trackers, and structural physicists completely refuse to accept the official icequake narrative as an absolute answer. They note that while icebergs fracturing can produce immense sound payloads, the unique, undulating frequency shift and the distinct rising thrum of the bloop possessed a mathematical symmetry that has never been perfectly replicated by a random piece of collapsing ice. The case remains a lingering, profound anomaly in modern oceanography, an open-ended reminder that we know less about the layout of our deep ocean floor than we do about the surface of the moon. The dark trenches of the remote South Pacific continue to stand as a silent, high-pressure vault, keeping secrets that completely break our understanding of reality and proving that sometimes the absolute dark holds anomalies that are far more terrifying than anything our minds can engineer. The stories presented in this episode are based on true historical accounts, official investigations, and documented archival data. However, the forensic, medical, and psychological profiles discussed are intended strictly for educational, historical, and entertainment purposes. None of the material presented within this program should be utilized as clinical case studies, official legal references, or medical advice. If you or someone you know is experiencing psychological trauma, domestic distress, or personal safety concerns, please contact your local law enforcement agencies or professional crisis services immediately. Thank you for listening to this production of the MrBallen podcast channel. If you enjoyed these strange, dark, and mysterious accounts, please leave a review on your favorite streaming platform, and remember to check back every Monday and Thursday morning for a completely new look into the absolute shadows of our world.